Axel Montes, and he's got a really interesting background. He's a neuroscientist, educator. He's done a lot of research in the brain's process of modeling reality and perception in a specific area. And then also his recent research is in beneficial AI and virtual reality. And so he's going to take us on a little tour of consciousness. I don't know if you heard, but I gave a brief introduction about your background and the fact that you're going to give us a little tour of consciousness and hopefully give us some ideas of kind of turning inward a little bit and kind of capping things off before we start with Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on with this really nice panel. I've been listening in and it's fantastic. So basically, my sort of meta goal in professionally and personally is sort of like aiming for a kind of Rosetta Stone of my two passions, which is neuroscience and self-cultivation, or you could say body-mind practice. So, you know, it's very much sort of in the mainstream now, even to be into mindfulness, and psychedelics have started to really have a renaissance, which is really positive for awareness of general the potentials of consciousness. For myself, it's been many years that I've been involved in both, and I remember early, even in my undergrad days, when I was pushing to do psychedelic research and everyone was saying no because it was still kind of, we weren't out of the dark ages, so to speak. Now it's really great to see everybody kind of back in. So the view I think that is the pandemic, the current one, is currently really ushering us, inviting us into, is one from a much higher viewpoint of 25,000 feet, in which we are viewing the world and ourselves from the point of view of nature kind of with a capital N, so to speak. And in a sense, our species and all the multiple species and COVID, the view for nature is essentially just of interdependent aggregates that are part of a complex system at varying scales, interacting biologically, psychologically, through the kind of fear responses we're seeing and people taking advantage of the fear as well, and also communities that are emerging. So the view in a sense is one where one becomes aware as an individual of the interdependent aggregate nature and existence. Typically, our view is kind of, for neuroscientific and cognitive reasons, is sort of bound like gingerbread cookie to the physical. That has to do with the many generations and the whole lifetime that each of us lives, trying to survive and focusing on the response and stimulus and actions of the body and what we learn from that interaction proprioceptively, etc. But the reason that we think the self is anchored into the body is really because the body is the nexus of all the multiple sensory stimuli that arrive. Because they're arriving at the one place, we interpret that this is the nexus of our location. And so in a sense, consciousness, which if we're skeptical, we don't necessarily say, okay, it's definitely coming from the body, located in the brain. If we just kind of leave it to time and science and experience to prove it, we can say, well, just the fact that things are occurring, all the multisensory stimulation is arriving at this body, and therefore our the mind, in a sense, puts more resources into focus body. It doesn't necessarily mean that the mind is located in the body. You know, one of the questions I like to ask with regards to, you know, philosophical questions of where is the mind as well. I ask, well, you can tell me of your brain, right? But can you tell me of your mind? So it's a very different kind of ontology and epistemology. So bodily self-consciousness and the neural mechanisms that produce it, the sense of this body is mine and I'm located here, strongly condition the sense of self and where we believe consciousness is. So in a sense, body-mind practices of non-ordinary consciousness, as I would call it, that lead us into experiences that are not in the ordinary that we experience every day when we're filling out our check or checking our email or grabbing food. These practices usher our worldview into a more expansive place where we're aware of interdependent aggregation. So you can kind of see the difference if you look at the way that we view nature now. We typically view nature as something in the environment, and it feels like a wall of green, rather than being a continuum of exchange of energy that is not just intellectually, cognized or apprehended, but rather is something that is experienced and lived. So ordinary consciousness practices take us gradually in that direction. Particularly, starting mindfulness is great to get people in a place of relaxation, which then releases the inner tensions that pretty much shackle you to perception limited to the body. But beyond mindfulness, which is kind of the first wave of that we're going through in society right now, there are very, very specific practices that address very specific things in consciousness and take you in the directions you want to go into. So one of those practices, for example, is called Maha Mudra, which is a Sanskrit word, also used in Tibetan Buddhism, which basically means great gesture. But the point of the practice is essentially centering yourself in the core of your kind of watching experience, so you can't go back anymore. You're observing the observer and so on and so forth. And from there, viewing an object or sets of objects and asking kind of in a very open way, where are interdependent aggregates? Can I separate different causes? Can I determine the different causes and what effects they give? And the more and more open and less cognitive there is an approach to it of trying to analyze and break things down and determine a cause, the more that there's an openness while observing and being with this awareness, there is a kind of sense that there is kind of no origin and no destination, but kind of just a sea of changing independent aggregate. And from this point of view, you could start with just in this practice focusing on one object, or you can then open up into your peripheral, maintaining your eye focus forward, and you'll know that your mind will want to jump around and analyze certain things. That kind of jumping around and getting out of your body, going into subject-object duality, is in essence a separation of a cutting, a severing of that continuity very subtly. You can go and analyze something, but to actually still be in continuity with a different matter, and that needs to be practiced. So the obstacle here to this is essentially how much our brain is in the habit of holding on to the one identification body, and this has very roots in our evolution. Also, the human species is in a sense a collection of builders. We're all makers, and we do this it's kind of innate in our cognition to externalize and build things. As we traverse through an environment in which we're trying to survive and preserve homeostasis, part of what we do is try to problem solve, or at least creatively experiment with the environment with our hands, as we're bipeds and we have an open hand brain loop. Our hands are not glued to the ground, so we can engage in experiments manually, dexterously, and also then symbolic experiences when we can't reach for the object, but we can then our minds to reach for it. So every time we make a tool, say a stone axe, you are experimenting almost proto-scientifically with your environment. And the moment you make that tool, that cognitive effort that was used to make that tool to solve a particular problem, or at least creatively experiment your way into a solution you find after the fact, that's all a process of exercising the mind through creative problem solving and tool building. Now that took us that process from stone axes to art, automobiles, factories, calculators, and even artificial intelligence. So even today, it's part of almost like a subtle effort in mind that they're trying to almost replicate, because we project our own self-identity into everything we make, and everything we make is very much tailored to our needs and the needs of those around us. So in a sense, what we create, everything around us, from the architecture to the artifacts to the tools and the art, is a product of the collective problem solving that we've all been engaged in. And that comes from, and that is born of, our image of ourselves at any given moment. Because the more we build, the more we understand ourselves. So what we build is then conditioned upon our self-understanding at any moment. Now, the issue there, I would argue, is that we don't fully understand our capability of consciousness unless we dig into the treasury of techniques that have been offered by the world's wisdom traditions and indigenous traditions over the eons, the centuries and the millennia, and use those techniques. We can eschew the dogma if we like, and then just focus on what those techniques are for human consciousness. And then we get a better idea of who we actually are and what we're capable of. And then our bar for the kinds of works we produce is raised. You can almost say that we would less easily fall for some kind of a Turing test as to whether an AI is actually intelligent. Our bar for the capabilities of human intelligence is set higher and higher the more we practice and integrate these techniques. So in a sense, there's the of creating the world we want to create, and the view from nature of interdependent aggregation of a understanding that we're situated in a complex system with which we're continuous, is a matter of unearthing human intelligence and then translating, executing that into the artifacts that we make individually and collectively. This then starts to kind of create the world that we want. These instances like pandemics now create an opportunity to like level and our conscious focus our awareness on one. It's very seldom that all of humanity, let alone in a globalized era, that can create solutions to and focus on one thing and the local solutions that are both local and global at the same time. Now, we actually get to this place where we're bootstrapping our consciousness into the directions we actually want to. Well, there's various tools available, but essentially it's you want to be aware of the way in which consciousness works at a cognitive level, so you can turn your predictive nations as we were talking about earlier, the previous panelist, that loop of just constant stasis, staying in habit, and propel it into a spiral driven by intent, openness to change. And that there's various ways of doing that. That's one of the projects that I've been working on in my career, is creating a sort of neurophenomenological framework that can enact the parts of cognition that are necessary for certain experiences. And it would be very amazing if we can crowdsource knowledge into such a framework and use that as a knowledge base, the amazing intelligence of human beings, and then from there, use that as a jumping point to build better AI. And to get into these non-ordinary consciousness, to build them as traits, just occasional items, due to nootropics or small sessions of mindfulness, we need constant immersion in these practices, even while we're interacting with the world. So only about sitting, also getting up off your mat or getting out of the psychedelic session and taking those insights and forward, and then using further tools that open the neuroendocrine system's abilities, that one can actually amplify the feelings and the conditions psychologically, emotionally, physically, that produce comfort in being in a constantly critical transition, as you transition from one idea of who you are and what you think you are to the next one, and being able to traverse those criticality thresholds till eventually we a stable view from nature from 25,000 feet, and understand, feeling and embodying the fact that nature is a continuum, and that it represents the kind of evolved complexity that we can only aspire to replicate in advanced AI. And I think on that note, our next speaker here is we'll talk a bit about advanced AI and the potential in that realm. So yeah, thank you, Greg. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Awesome. I guess I'm just curious, this is an amazing talk. I mean, thinking about the physiological aspects of kind of growth and consciousness, and how we look at the world, and kind of changing the way our perspective on looking at the world and so forth. I'm just curious if you are fairly optimistic, like after we get through this mess that we're in now, that there will be a net benefit to the fact that we're all sitting at home, spending more time with ourselves, more opportunities to be creative. If we, obviously a lot of people are going to suffer, lose family members, economic challenges are going to be just an incredible tidal wave affecting a lot of people. But do you think in the end, say we get out 5 years and 10 years, that this could potentially be a net benefit to humanity?
I think it could be if we choose to look at it that way. I think ultimately it's a choice because there are people who will be disproportionately affected by this negatively and others positively. But I think striving to take the opportunity of kind of a home staycation or a work vacation, however it is for each individual, to learn to spend time with themselves. There's people I've talked to that really know how to be with themselves. And for someone like me whose hobbies have been very kind of balanced between extrospective and introspective. I'm a guitarist and musician. I read, I say, and then I also go out and do things. So I can kind of draw from both, but a lot of people, I think, have to learn to be with their interior self and see the vast expanse that is there in themselves, and then translate that into something beneficial. So to your question, I think it's a way of, okay, you know, if I have lemons, I'm gonna make lemonade, and it's gonna be a damn good lemonade.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining. I'm going to get Ben on the line and have the closing conversation, but this perspective is really interesting. I think your work in neuroscience and AI and virtual reality and stuff is so intriguing and important and interesting. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you.